A German shepherd emerged from the snowstorm alone, limping, his coat matted with frost and old blood. He was never meant to be found again, but deep in the frozen forest, behind a truck engulfed in flames, 3 police officers lay bound and silent, left to die. No one saw the dog coming. No one believed he would return. But he remembered their scent, and he remembered what it meant to be saved. What happened next will make you cry and believe in second chances, even for those who were forgotten. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe that no soul human or animal should be left behind in the cold, hit that subscribe button, because this one might just restore your faith in miracles. The snow had fallen relentlessly for 3 straight days in the mountains east of Helena, Montana. Pines bowed under the weight of thick ice, and the only sounds were the groans of trees swaying against the wind and the occasional crack of a distant branch succumbing to the cold. The forest here was old, untouched, a place where satellite signals vanished and even seasoned hikers carried flares just in case. In the heart of this remote woodland, at the edge of a frozen ravine, smoke curled into the night sky, thin at first, then rising thick and black. Tom Radley stirred before his mind caught up. The world was sideways. His head throbbed like it had been split by a brick, and there was a taste of blood in his mouth. He blinked once, then again, eyes struggling to focus against the red and orange flickers reflecting off snow-covered trees. The smell of gasoline and burning rubber made him gag. Tom was 42, a sergeant with the Helena PD for nearly 2 decades. He had the solid, weathered build of a man who spent more time outdoors than in, with a short salt-and-pepper beard and crow's feet around eyes that had seen too much. He was quiet, methodical, someone who rarely raised his voice but made people listen when he did. After his wife died in a hiking accident 7 winters ago, Tom had changed, became more withdrawn, less trusting of good news. But his dedication never wavered, and neither did his instinct to protect. Now, groggy and bound at the wrists, Tom realized he was lying in the bed of a pickup truck. Its tailgate was shut, its interior charred in places. Beside him, 2 other figures stirred. Ben Cruz was the first to groan. At 34, Ben was sharp-tongued, sharp-jawed, and always moving, a former Marine turned narcotics officer who'd transferred from Albuquerque 2 years prior. His dark eyes snapped open, blinking against the smoke, and his first word was an expletive. His tan skin glistened with sweat despite the freezing air, and his hands were tied behind his back like Tom's. "Dale," Tom rasped, voice hoarse. "You okay?" Dale Holloway, just 27 and the youngest in the trio, didn't answer at first. He was lanky, boyish-faced, with sandy blonde hair matted to his forehead. Fresh out of academy 2 years ago, Dale had the optimism of someone still believing in clean lines between good and evil. He was also the one who always volunteered for holiday shifts and carried dog treats in his cruiser, just in case. When he finally groaned and opened his eyes, panic flared. What's burning?" Tom twisted his neck. "The truck." The flames had caught on the front seats, licking toward the roof. Snow dampened the area around them, but not fast enough. The fire crackled and hissed as metal twisted in the heat. They struggled against their bond's old rope, tight, soaked in melted snow. Their legs were free, but with hands behind their backs there was little room to maneuver. "How the hell did this happen?" Ben gasped, trying to kick against the side. "Last thing I remember is checking that trail camera near the missing hiker site." "Someone was waiting for us," Tom said through clenched teeth, "and they didn't want us coming back." Outside the truck, the snow whispered. Wind snaked through the trees and flakes danced across the frozen ground. The woods should have been silent. But something moved. At first, it was just a shadow. Low, quick, almost feline. Then it emerged through the smoke, a large German shepherd, coated in gray ash and old mud, with one ear slightly bent and a long scar running down its left flank. Its coat, once deep sable, was now a dusty mix of black and tan, peppered with frost. The dog's eyes rich brown with flecks of gold locked onto the fire, then onto the truck, then onto Tom. This was Ranger. Ranger was 7 years old, once a K-9 unit with a different department downstate, presumed lost during a raid 2 winters ago. After a building collapsed, he'd vanished into the wilderness. Some said he was dead, others that he'd turned feral. No one knew the truth. Ranger wasn't feral, but he wasn't tame either. He had survived on instinct and fragments of training, roaming forests and dodging humans who meant no good, but scent that never faded. And Tom's scent, from a training seminar years ago, had lingered like smoke in Ranger's memory. The dog moved swiftly now, nose low, ignoring the heat, the crackle of fire. His breath clouded the air in short bursts. He leapt onto the truck bed with practiced grace. "Is that—" Dale whispered. Ranger pressed his muzzle to Tom's shoulder, then circled, sniffing the ropes. Without hesitation, he bit down, not hard enough to harm, but just enough to test. Then, decisively, he clamped and tore. The rope snapped. Tom didn't question it. He yanked free his wrists, burning his skin, and moved fast to untie Ben and Dale. Flames leapt closer. Ben kicked at the tailgate until it groaned open, snow spilling into the bed. "Go!" Tom shouted. They stumbled out, coughing, dragging Dale between them. The truck groaned again, flames devouring the dash. Then a blast, a small one, rocked the forest as the fire reached the gas tank. Metal burst. Smoke shot upward. They dove behind a drift as embers rained down. Behind them, Ranger stood alert, eyes never leaving them. He didn't bark, he didn't flinch. He simply watched until all 3 men breathed alive. Tom turned, his face raw with shock and gratitude. "You saved us," he muttered, and for just a moment, Ranger wagged his tail once. The acrid smoke lingered in their lungs long after the explosion faded. Bits of scorched debris floated down like dark snowflakes against the real ones falling from the Montana sky. The wind had picked up, howling softly through the pines, and the sharp scent of burning rubber still clung to the air like a warning not yet spent. Tom Radley sat against a snow-covered log, his breath shallow. The back of his thigh throbbed with each inhale, a deep cut, likely from twisted metal in the truck bed. His pants were torn and blood seeped into the snow beneath him, steaming faintly in the cold. Ranger stood nearby, alert, ears pivoting like satellite dishes. His thick coat was singed in places, his right shoulder coated in soot, and his paw bled from a glass shard lodged near the pad. But he didn't whimper. He didn't slow down. Ben Cruz crouched beside Tom, pressing a ripped piece of shirt into the wound. "It's deep," he muttered. "Not arterial, thank God. But we need shelter soon, or you'll seize up." Ben's fingers moved with clinical precision. He'd once done trauma rotations in the Marines before joining narcotics. The field always came back to him when bullets or flames were involved. A few feet away, Dale Holloway was on all fours, retching into the snow. His face was pale, rimmed with sweat despite the cold. His breaths came in short, panicked bursts. I couldn't breathe. In there, it felt like the air was fire, he choked, eyes wild. Ben looked over his shoulder. "Dale, look at me." Dale didn't. His hands trembled as he clutched a patch of ground like it would keep him tethered. Tom gritted his teeth, forcing himself upright. "He's having a panic attack," he growled through pain. "Get his attention, now." Ben moved to Dale, grabbing his collar gently but firmly. "Hey, listen to me, you're out. We're alive. The fire's gone. Feel this?" He pressed Dale's hand to a patch of cold snow. "That's real. You're safe." It took half a minute before Dale met his eyes. "Safe," he repeated. "We're safe?" "Thanks to him," Tom said, looking toward Ranger. The dog had begun to pace in tight, deliberate circles, his nose low. Then, like a compass snapping to north, he turned sharply and headed downhill, through the trees. "He's tracking," Tom said, wincing as he stood. "He wants us to follow." "But to where?" Ben asked. "Does it matter?" Tom countered. "He saved our lives. I'll take my chances with him over whoever left us for dead." They started moving, slow and uneven. Tom limped with Ben supporting one side. Dale, still pale but steadier, brought up the rear. The snow came to their ankles now, deeper where it had drifted. Their breath crystallized mid-air. The trees closed in tight, crowding out the light. Halfway down a slope, Dale stumbled on something buried under the snow. He bent and pulled it free. A charred corner of a police-issued scarf. He turned it over. A barely visible HPD was stitched into the singed edge. He held it up silently. Ben cursed under his breath. "That's Helena Police Department gear." Tom's jaw clenched. So, whoever did this, they had access. "Or they were one of us," Dale whispered. Ranger barked once, sharply. Not a warning, more of a command. "Keep moving," Tom said grimly. Ranger led them across a narrow gulch. The ground here was treacherous, half-frozen roots, patches of hidden ice. Twice, Dale slipped. Once, Ben had to haul him upright before he pitched into a ditch. The dog stopped twice, first to sniff at a snare wire half buried in snow, then to avoid a deadfall trap triggered and left to rot. "You're kidding me," Ben muttered, eyeing the crude hunting trap. "That's not natural. This is set up for people, not deer." "Which means someone really doesn't want visitors," Tom said, shifting his weight and hissing in pain. At last, through a break in the trees, a dark silhouette emerged. A cabin, small and leaning slightly to one side, half sunken into a rise. The wood was worn, but the roof intact. A shutter banged lightly in the wind. Smoke stains marked an old chimney. Ranger moved faster now, tail straight, ears forward. He darted to the door and scratched once, then looked back. Ben reached it first, pushing it open with the butt of his elbow. The hinges creaked, but didn't break. Inside was stale air, dust, and the faint scent of dried herbs. It was one roomstone hearth, a small cot with a mildewed blanket, a broken lantern, and shelves lined with cans, long expired. A stack of split logs sat in one corner. Someone had been here, but not recently. Ranger circled the interior, sniffing each corner. Then he padded to the hearth and sat. Tom collapsed onto the cot. "Good dog," he rasped. "Damn good dog." Ben moved to the fireplace, tossing in a handful of kindling from the dry pile. He grabbed a pack of matches from his pocket, the only thing that hadn't been stripped from them. It took 3 strikes, but flame caught. As heat returned to the room, Dale knelt near the window, staring out into the darkening woods. "Tom," he said quietly, "you think this cabin belonged to him? The dog?" Tom looked toward Ranger, who had laid his head on his paws, eyes still half open, scanning the room. "Yeah," Tom said slowly. "Or someone he used to know." Outside, snow began to fall harder, muffling sound and sealing the world in white. Inside, 3 men breathed in the scent of old wood and new fire, and a dog, scarred and tired, lay between them, still keeping watch. The wind howled through the trees like a chorus of mourning wolves. Outside, the snow thickened into sheets, muting the world in a white silence that settled over the cabin like a burial cloth. Inside, shadows flickered against warped wooden walls as the fire crackled in the hearth. The small space was barely large enough for the 3 men and the dog, but for now it was enough. Tom Radley sat propped against the cot, his leg bound tightly with strips from Dale's undershirt. The bleeding had slowed, but the pain pulsed like a second heartbeat. His eyes, heavy-lidded, stayed fixed on the fire while his mind circled the image of that burnt scarf and the implications it carried. Someone with a badge had set them up. Ben Cruz was kneeling beside Dale, who had been bundled in the mildewed blanket. Sweat slicked the young officer's brow despite the near-freezing temperature, and his skin had taken on a pale gray hue. His breathing was shallow, his body curled slightly in a fetal position. "He's burning up," Ben muttered, touching Dale's forehead. "From the smoke or the burns, I don't know. Could be both. If this keeps up, we're going to lose him." Ben had stripped to his thermal undershirt to cover Dale's chest and shoulders, trying to conserve as much warmth as possible. His marine instincts kicked in again, not barking orders, but calm and efficient, always calculating odds. Tom exhaled slowly. "We need a med kit, antibiotics, even something to cool the fever." "I know," Ben said, "but there's nothing here but expired beans and moldy jerky." Ranger stirred from the shadows. He had been curled in the darkest corner of the room, his massive form barely distinguishable from the pile of firewood beside him. But now he rose, his muscles bunching under his thick winter coat. He sniffed the air, paced once, then slipped through the partially open door into the snow without a sound. "He's leaving?" Dale mumbled, half-conscious. "No," Tom said quietly. "He's doing what he does best." Outside, the forest swallowed Ranger in seconds. He moved like a whisper between trees, his nose scanning every inch of frozen earth. The air was sharp, tinged with the scent of sap and ash. He paused near a fallen log, ears twitching, then leapt forward, paws silent against the powdery crust. Back in the cabin, Ben used his flashlight to scan the interior for anything useful. It was low on battery, but the pale beam caught something on the far wall, scratched into the wood in deep, old lines. AC 1985. He ran his fingers across the engraving. "Hey, Tom, you see this?" Tom turned his head slowly. Initials and a year. "Could be someone who lived here," Ben said. "Maybe someone still does." "Or used to," Tom replied. "Long time ago." Ben stepped back, letting his eyes take in the rest of the space. The shelf near the hearth held a few relics, a cracked compass, a rusted hunting knife, a book of Montana trail maps, pages swollen from moisture. It all reeked of someone who had once known the wild deeply, but hadn't been here in years. A sudden scraping noise at the door made Ben reach for the fire poker instinctively. But when it creaked open, Ranger stepped inside again. His fur was dusted in fresh snow, and in his jaws dangled a limp gray shape, a dead squirrel, still warm. Ben blinked. "I'll be damned." Ranger dropped the animal by the fire, then turned and disappeared again into the night. Tom looked toward the squirrel. "He's feeding us." Ben nodded, already preparing a makeshift spit using a split wood stake and the rusty grill grate they found under the cot. "He's doing more than that. He's surviving for us." It was nearly an hour later, with Dale slipping in and out of a sweat-drenched haze, that Ranger returned once more this time, dragging something larger behind him through the snow. A small duffel bag. Tom's breath caught. "Is that?" Ben rushed over and opened it. Inside was a standard-issue emergency medical kit, the outside scorched black, but the contents inside largely intact. Gauze, burn cream, a sealed bottle of amoxicillin, and a small flashlight with extra batteries. The heat pack inside still crackled faintly when snapped. "He went back," Ben whispered, "to the truck." Ranger sat down, panting hard. His right paw still bled from the shard, but his tail thumped weakly. He licked at the melted snow on the floor, then returned to his corner. They worked quickly. Ben administered the antibiotic, applied cream to Dale's burns, and wrapped him in the heat pack beneath the blanket. Tom, despite his pain, took charge of rotating Dale's body slowly to prevent stiffness and frostbite. By midnight, Dale's fever had broken slightly. He slept in uneven intervals, but the panic had faded from his face. Tom watched Ranger for a long time. The dog had returned to his post near the fire, though he kept glancing at the door, ears twitching. Always alert. "You think he belonged to AC?" Tom asked. Ben shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe he just remembered where something useful was buried. He's more than smart," Tom said. "He's trained. That's not just instinct." They fell into a tense silence, the fire popping between them. Snow battered the windows and the cracks in the walls, but the flame held. And so did they. For now. By the time the fire had dwindled into embers, the wind outside had risen to a low, sorrowful wail that swept through the trees and rattled the cracked window panes. Darkness wrapped tightly around the cabin, pressing against the wooden walls like a living thing. Inside, the air was thick with the stale scent of damp wool, blood-soaked bandages, and faint smoke. Tom Radley hadn't slept. He sat upright near the fireplace, his injured legs stretched out, teeth clenched against the pulsing ache. His eyes had adjusted to the dark, He could see the outline of Ben dozing with one hand still loosely gripping a piece of firewood like a weapon. Dale lay huddled under the blanket, shallow breath audible in the quiet, no longer feverish but far from stable. Ranger sat at the door. The dog's body was still, but his ears were sharp, pivoting every few seconds. His tail was low, fur on edge. He hadn't blinked in minutes. Something was out there. Tom reached slowly for the fire poker leaning beside him, hand closing around the cool metal. He glanced toward the door where Ranger remained statuesque, his body coiled with a silent tension. Then, barely audible, a soft crunch in the snow. Ranger growled. It was low, primal, the kind of warning sound that tightened the spine. Ben stirred awake instantly. Tom pressed a finger to his lips, and Ben nodded silently, reaching for his belt, not that he had a weapon anymore. Another sound closer now. A scrape. Then a muffled clatter, like something shifting against wood. Ranger rose, his hackles lifted. Then he barked once, loud and deep, and bolted out the door before anyone could stop him. "Ranger!" Tom called, but the dog had vanished into the dark. Ben was already up, boots crunching against the old floorboards, pulling the door open. Cold wind and snow blasted in, stinging their eyes. The moon, pale and distant behind the clouds, barely illuminated the clearing. Then they saw it footprints. Not theirs, not Ranger's, but fresh human ones. Wide, deep, with treads that matched tactical boots. "Someone's been circling us," Ben muttered, eyes narrowing. "Watching," Tom added grimly. "They were waiting for something." Dale stirred, groaning. Tom limped over and helped pull him further into the corner, away from the windows. Ben dropped to a knee near the edge of the porch and brushed away snow. "There's more," he said. "2 sets. One lighter, maybe a lookout. One heavier stood near the back window." Tom's face tightened. "That's less than 10 feet from where Dale was lying. Could have taken a shot if they wanted to. Or were waiting for someone to give the order." A sharp bark rang out from the trees, then silence. Tom and Ben froze. "Was that a warning or a fight?" Ben asked. Neither waited. Ben grabbed the flashlight, flicked it on, and swung the beam across the tree line. A faint flash of movement Ranger was circling the far edge of the cabin, his body low, tail straight. Tom hobbled to the other side and caught sight of something in the snow, a small metallic glint half buried near the base of a pine. He leaned down and scooped it up with a gloved hand. A drone. Small, black, with its blade snapped and the lens shattered. Tom turned it over. A custom serial number was etched into the side. "Fly cam," he muttered. "This one was high-end, not civilian. Tactical surveillance grade." "Whoever sent this," Ben said, appearing at his side, "knew what they were doing." Ranger returned a moment later, his breath rapid, nostrils flared. His muzzle was damp with melted snow, and a line of saliva hung from his jaw more from intensity than fatigue. He stalked the perimeter once more, then re-entered the cabin, brushing past Ben's leg before sitting heavily by the hearth again. "Did he chase them off?" Dale's voice croaked from the cot. He was awake now, watching them with glassy eyes. Tom nodded. "Yeah, for now." Ben turned the drone over. "They know we're alive. They're watching. But the question is, why haven't they come back to finish the job?" Tom's jaw flexed. "Maybe they're afraid." "Of what?" Tom looked down at Ranger, who hadn't taken his eyes off the door. "Of him." The rest of the night passed with the fire burning low and no more sounds outside. Still, none of the men truly slept. Ranger paced restlessly, ears twitching every time the wind changed. The sense of being watched never left. By dawn, the footprints had been covered with fresh snow. The drone remained, broken and cold, lying like a dead insect on the windowsill, but the air felt different. Like the forest was holding its breath, and so were they. The cold had sharpened with the coming dawn. It no longer whispered but sliced through fabric, through skin, through bone. In the pale gray light of early morning, the forest around the cabin stood deathly still. No birdsong, no wind, just silence so absolute it felt like the world had paused. Ranger had sensed them first. He had been restless since before sunrise, pacing the small perimeter of the cabin, tail stiff, hackles raised. His ears tilted at every sound, though none came. But when he stopped at the edge of the tree line, body frozen like a statue carved in smoke and muscle, Tom Radley knew something was wrong. Ben Cruz, peeking through the broken shutter, muttered, "We've got company." Through the trees, 6 figures moved in staggered formation, dressed in black tactical gear, rifles slung, masks up. They moved like they knew the land, stepping between drifts with precision. Not police, not military. Professionals of a different breed. One of them paused near the trail and raised a satellite phone. His voice, low and rough, carried just far enough. "He'll be pissed if there's any sign they got out. If Creighton finds footprints, he'll skin us." Creighton. The name landed in the air like a falling blade. Tom's face darkened. So, it is him. Ben didn't respond. He already had Dale halfway out of the cot, one arm draped over his shoulder. Tom turned to Ranger. "We need a way out. Now." Ranger didn't wait. The dog bolted into the underbrush, stopping just long enough to look back. Then he barked once, sharp and urgent. They followed. The escape wasn't elegant. Tom's legs screamed with every step. Dale stumbled in a haze, and Ben had to drag them both at times. But Ranger led the way, threading through narrow passes, frozen gullies, and deer trails hidden beneath snow. His nose stayed low, ears high, weaving a route the hunters wouldn't expect. Back at the cabin, the hunters spread out. One of them, a tall man with thick forearms and a long scar down the left side of his jaw, crouched near the fire pit and touched the still warm ashes. "They were here," he growled. The man on the phone, shorter, built like a coiled spring with narrow blue eyes, muttered, "Creighton said the truck went up at 0200. They couldn't have gotten far." "They had help," the scarred man replied. His name was Kyle Thorne, an ex-mercenary who had spent years in Africa before vanishing off any legal record. He had the kind of voice that never rose and never needed to. "Find them," he ordered. Back in the woods, the 3 officers moved as fast as they could. Every branch, every snap beneath their boots felt like a gunshot. Tom gritted his teeth through the pain, but the blood seeping through his bandage had darkened again. Dale was still half-conscious, murmuring nonsense about his academy graduation. They crossed a frozen stream. Then they heard it. Barking rangers from somewhere behind them. Loud, defiant, fast. Tom spun around. "He's drawing them off." Ben grabbed his shoulder. "And we need to move now." They kept going, but now there were more sound shouts in the distance, the crack of twigs under heavy boots. The dog's barking faded, then swelled again closer. Then a yelp. Tom stopped. "He's hurt." "We go back, we all die," Ben snapped. "He's buying time. We use it." Ranger had backtracked into one of the ravines north of the cabin, a hunting corridor filled with old steel traps long abandoned but still deadly. As the hunters approached, Ranger had doubled back, circling to intercept them with a barrage of barks that echoed through the pines like a dozen animals instead of one. He led them up a false ridge, away from the real trail, and into a mess of thorns and half-frozen mud. But his right forepaw caught one of the rusted traps snapping shut just above the pad. The pain was instant, searing, but Ranger didn't cry out again. He bit down on a stick, yanked once, tore free with blood trailing behind. Enough to limp, enough to run. Back with the others, Ben found the entrance to a hollow beneath a rock ledge, a pocket of earth hidden from above by snow and roots. "In here," he hissed, pulling Tom and Dale inside. They huddled together in silence, breath fogging. The shouts grew distant, then scattered. The men were chasing ghosts now. Ranger's scent had confused them, split their formation. An hour passed before they heard Ranger's soft whine at the mouth of the hollow. He limped in, muzzle bloody, paw torn, but still holding strong. Tom reached for him. "You're bleeding." Ranger collapsed beside them, chest heaving, and for the first time since the fire, he let his eyes close. The hollow beneath the rock shelf was cold and cramped, but it had held. Snow drifted silently outside, blanketing the world in a dull white hush. Inside, 3 men and 1 wounded dog breathed in close quarters, surrounded by roots, dirt, and silence so deep it made their thoughts louder. Tom Radley lay with his back against the damp stone, his injured leg stretched out stiffly. The bleeding had slowed, but the stiffness crept up his hip and into his spine. His breath came in shallow pulls. He couldn't sleep, not with Ranger's quiet whimpers a few inches away. The dog lay curled tight, his injured foreleg tucked under him. Blood had crusted around the puncture wound from the trap. His chest rose and fell with a shallow, uneven rhythm. Still, his eyes remained open, just barely tracking every movement, every breath. Tom watched him, something in his chest twisting. Ben and Dale had both fallen into restless sleep. Dale had improved slightly, his fever down, though he mumbled in dreams, fragmented sentences about training days, his parents, his badge. Ben dozed sitting up, one hand on a rock as if it were a baton. Tom leaned toward Ranger and reached out slowly. The dog didn't flinch, didn't growl. His nose twitched as Tom's fingers brushed the thick fur behind his ear. And then, softly, Tom whispered, "I know you." The words came from nowhere, just instinct, memory rising like vapor from snow. Tom closed his eyes and let it come. 5 years ago, before he transferred to Helena, he had been a lieutenant in Missoula. There had been a landslide in the Bitterroots after a rogue snowstorm. One of their K-9 units had gone missing buried beneath rubble in a collapsed ranger station. That dog had a name then. Ranger. Tom had led the team that dug through the ruins. He was the one who crawled under a broken beam, freezing and soaked, to pull a black and tan German shepherd from the wreckage. The dog had been half-conscious, muzzle bleeding, leg broken. But even then, he had licked Tom's hand once before going limp. They had sent him off for surgery and recovery. A few months later, Tom had left the department. The dog had vanished during a failed transport, presumed lost, but now... Here he was. Tom pressed his palm gently to Ranger's neck, feeling the old scar beneath the fur. "You remembered me," he murmured. "Didn't you?" Ranger shifted, eyes meeting Tom's. Not the bright, eager eyes of a puppy but tired ones, clouded by pain and time. And then, in a gesture so familiar it stole Tom's breath, the dog leaned forward and placed his head gently against Tom's chest, just like he had 5 years ago. A sound caught in Tom's throat. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. He stroked Ranger's fur, his other hand gripping the crumpled reflective strip from the jacket they had scavenged in the cabin before fleeing. Ben stirred. "You okay?" Tom nodded. "Yeah, he's one of mine." "From Missoula." Ben blinked the sleep from his eyes. "Seriously?" Tom didn't explain further. He just looked down at Ranger and said softly, "We're getting out of here. All of us." The morning light came pale and watery, barely breaking through the cloud cover. Visibility was limited, but Tom knew they had to take a chance. He reached into the side of the duffel. Inside was a torn emergency blanket with a thin reflective lining. "Ben," he said, "I've got an idea." An hour later, Tom and Ben had climbed a narrow ridge above the hollow. The view opened slightly, just enough to see across the valley. Barely visible in the distance was a stretch of frozen logging road, one that might lead toward civilization. "If we can mark this ridge, and we send a signal..." Tom trailed off. Ben nodded. "We just need them to know we're here." Tom tied the reflective strip to a long branch and anchored it into the snow, angling it like a flag. The sun, weak as it was, caught the material and sent a glimmer down into the trees. But it wasn't enough. Then Ranger stood. He limped toward the ridge, his injured paw dragging slightly. Before Tom could stop him, the dog took the reflective jacket in his teeth, trotted to the edge of the ridge, and dropped it. Then he barked loud, clear, and rhythmic. 3 sharp barks. A pause. Then 3 again. Tom's eyes widened. "He's using an alert signal." "Like a beacon," Ben said, jaw tight. "He knows someone might hear it." Far below, across the forest, a faint engine hum, maybe a snowmobile, echoed against the hills. They waited. Minutes passed. Then a glint, something moving across the treetops. A helicopter. Tom dropped to one knee, waving both arms, shouting. Beside him, Ranger barked again, his tail wagging weakly. Ben pulled out the emergency flare from the medkit and cracked it. A bright red plume shot into the gray sky. And somewhere between the broken rock and frozen trees, hope cracked through the cold. The snow had begun to thin as the sun clawed its way through heavy morning clouds. Tree branches glittered with frost, and though the air remained sharp, a faint warmth whispered on the breeze, just enough to make the snow wet and heavy underfoot. With Ranger limping beside them and Dale supported between Tom and Ben, the group pushed through the final stretch of trees until a dilapidated structure emerged ahead. The old fire lookout station stood like a forgotten sentinel above the valley. 2 stories tall and partially buried in drifting snow, its wood siding had peeled to gray and its roof sagged to one side. A broken solar panel hung loose from the upper floor, swinging gently with the wind. Tom's breath hitched. That radio might still work. Depends how much rodent damage we find, Ben muttered, adjusting Dale's weight on his shoulder. Still better odds than standing around waving jackets. Ranger was the first to reach the porch. Though his paw still bled, he forced himself forward, nose low, ears alert. He paused once, sniffed the air, then limped through the open doorframe no longer attached to any actual door. Inside, the station was thick with dust and mouse droppings. A metal stove sat rusted in the corner, surrounded by chewed-up insulation and a fallen stack of firewood. The radio equipment rested on a battered desk beside a narrow, dirt-streaked window. Ben gently laid Dale down on an old cot, then moved to the radio. "Cross your fingers," he muttered. He flipped the toggle switch. Nothing. Then he checked the emergency battery pack mounted beneath the desk. It was intact, dusty, but clean. He gave it a gentle tap. A red light blinked. Tom leaned in. "Try channel 16. Emergency frequency." Ben adjusted the dials, static screaming into the room. He turned the volume down and slowly tuned until a faint crackle turned into fragmented voice. "Coast, visibility poor, Montana North sectors." Ben keyed the mic. "This is Sergeant Ben Cruz, Helena Police Department. We are in need of immediate rescue. 3 officers injured, 1 canine wounded. Last known location eastern tree line of Clearwater Forest near Red Valley. Firewatch Station East Ridge. Do you copy?" The reply was delayed, garbled. "Confirm. Repeat coordinates unclear. Identify again." Ben repeated the message. The signal caught this time. "Copy," the voice returned. "Dispatching air unit to coordinates. Approximate ETA 90 minutes. Hold position. Stay online if able." Tom exhaled hard. They heard us. But just as relief started to wash in, Ranger let out a guttural growl. He bolted from the desk, knocking over a rusted stool with his flank. He crouched low near the window, body tense, teeth bared. Tom moved toward him. "What is it?" Then glass shattered. A gunshot ripped through the window, spraying shards into the air. Ben dropped behind the desk, pulling Dale down with him. Tom dove to the side, crashing into a cabinet that split on impact. 3 figures stepped through the doorway like phantoms pulled from the trees. The first was unmistakable. Creighton. Tall, broad, wrapped in a dark overcoat despite the gear underneath. His eyes were cold, slate gray, and dead of expression. At 50, his silver-streaked beard gave him a patriarchal air, but his face was lined with cruelty. Once a decorated police commissioner, he'd vanished from public view after accusations of corruption were dropped with suspicious speed. Now he resurfaced armed and far from legitimate. To his left stood Logan Burr, late 30s, bald, with a hawkish nose and a twitch in his right eye. A former bounty hunter, now turned mercenary for hire. To the right was Drew Malik, younger, pale-skinned, with messy red hair, covered in tactical gear too new for someone with that much grime on his face. Creighton raised his pistol and aimed it at Tom. "Should have stayed in the fire." Ranger moved. Like lightning through a storm, the dog lunged, jaws open. He collided with Creighton just as his finger tightened on the trigger. The shot went wide, splintering the window frame behind Tom's head. Ranger sank his teeth into Creighton's wrist, the gun clattering to the floor. Creighton roared and stumbled back, shaking violently. Ben surged forward, slamming into Logan Burr and tackling him to the floor. They rolled into a rusted locker, fists swinging. Dale groaned behind the desk, unable to move. Tom crawled toward the dropped weapon. Drew Malik stepped into his path, knife in hand, but hesitated. Just long enough for Tom to drive a knee into his shin and knock him off balance. Tom snatched the pistol and turned it toward Creighton, who now had both hands around Ranger's neck, trying to force the dog off. "Let go," Tom barked, "or I'll drop you where you stand." Creighton froze. Ben pinned Logan down with a knee to the chest. Ranger, growling low, released Creighton's arm and backed off, but not before blood soaked the sleeve of Creighton's coat. Breathing heavy, Tom kept the gun trained. "On your knees, all of you." The three attackers slowly complied. Ranger limped back to Tom's side, head low but proud. Ben found plastic zip ties in Logan's gear vest and used them to bind their hands behind their backs. "So," he muttered, glancing at the bloodied folder Creighton had dropped when he fell. "What are you so desperate to bury?" He picked it up and opened it. Inside ledgers, coded logs, photos, names, amounts, coordinates. Ben's jaw tightened. This is a trafficking ledger. Creighton was laundering and moving people like cargo." Tom looked at Creighton, whose mouth twisted into a cruel, bleeding smile. "You should have stayed buried." Tom didn't answer. He turned toward the radio and keyed the mic. "This is Sergeant Radley. We have 3 hostiles restrained. Data recovered on site. Helicopter requested urgently. I repeat, urgently." Behind him, Ranger stood silent, his eyes fixed on the snow outside. The sound came first, distant, but rising like thunder rolling over mountains or a low wave cresting through the sky. Tom Radley stepped out of the station's shattered doorway. Blood dried on his face, his right hand still gripping the radio mic. The wind had died. The snowfall had stopped. Above him, the clouds had finally parted to reveal a sky so clear it looked scrubbed, painted in shades of amber and ice blue. The helicopter broke over the tree line seconds later, matte gray, with red and white insignias stenciled along the side. Montana, Search and Rescue. It hovered low over the clearing, rotor wash flattening trees and kicking snow into bursts. Ranger, though exhausted, didn't flinch. He stood beside Tom, his injured paw wrapped in a bandage, his ears flicking once at the wind. The chopper touched down fast and smooth. 2 medics jumped out first, followed by a woman in tactical black with a bright orange windbreaker and sharp, determined eyes. This was Captain Sarah Lorne, early 40s, tall and lean, with a commanding presence built from 20 years in wilderness ops. Her skin was fair and wind-burned, with a scar along her chin she never talked about. Sarah had once lost 3 hikers to a delayed extraction. Since then, she operated like every mission could be someone's last chance. There was no such thing as too fast or good enough with her. She strode directly to Tom. "You're Sergeant Radley?" "Yes," Tom nodded, his voice gravel. "Where are the others?" "Inside. One's unconscious, 2 more restrained." She signaled to her team. "Secure the cabin. Get the wounded loaded. I want a perimeter and a line to Helena Dispatch in 5 minutes." As medics rushed in, Sarah's gaze shifted to Ranger. "That your dog?" Tom looked down. "He is now." Ranger blinked up at him, tail giving a single slow thump against the snow. They loaded Dale first. His face was pale but peaceful, body wrapped in emergency blankets. Ben walked under his own power, though with a bruised jaw and a cracked rib. He flashed Tom a tired grin as he passed. "Told you we'd get out." Creighton and his 2 men were dragged out last. Plastic cuffs around their wrists, duct tape across their mouths after Drew tried spitting blood at a medic. Sarah personally stood guard as they were loaded into the second chopper, which arrived minutes later with federal agents. By the time Ranger was gently lifted onto a stretcher, the sky had gone soft gold. A medic, a young man named Eli, mid-20s with curly black hair and kind eyes, knelt beside the dog and ran his hands gently along his ribs. "You've been through hell, haven't you, boy?" Ranger didn't respond, but when Eli offered his hand, the dog licked it once. He's stable, Eli told Tom. We'll get him to veterinary emergency. You ride with us? Tom nodded. 3 days later, the storm broke entirely, and the sun returned to Helena. In a quiet room of the Ridgefield Animal Trauma Center, Ranger lay on a padded cot with fresh bandages, clean fur, and a bowl of cold water at his side. A new collar sat beside him, black leather, simple, with a tag that read, Ranger, K9 RT. Tom entered with a file tucked under one arm and a worn jacket in the other. He sat beside the cot. They're calling it the biggest bust in Montana's trafficking history, he said. Creighton's network 10 names, 3 states. Feds are losing their minds. Ranger turned his head slightly, watching him. They want to give me a medal, Tom went on, voice quieter. Ben, too. And you, actually. He opened the folder. Inside was a certificate, half official, half symbolic, issued by the city council. Attached to it was a small bronze badge shaped like a paw print with the words Honorary Service K9 inscribed. Tom clipped it gently to Ranger's new collar. You deserve it more than any of us, he murmured. Ranger's tail thumped again, soft and rhythmic. Tom leaned forward, resting his hand on the dog's shoulder. His voice caught in his throat as he whispered, No one gets left behind. Not this time. Not ever again. A week later, the adoption became official. Papers were signed. Ranger, once listed as presumed lost in action, was now retired, adopted, alive. That morning, a small ceremony was held outside Helena's courthouse. Snow dusted the steps as police officers stood in uniform, watching. Tom walked across the steps with Ranger at his side, now wearing a new harness that bore only 2 words, Still Here. As he paused before the gathered crowd, Tom didn't speak for long. He's not just a survivor, he said, voice steady. He's proof that loyalty doesn't die, that memory doesn't fade, and that when everything burns down sometimes, something stronger rises from the ash. He looked down at Ranger, then out toward the people watching. If you ever think no one remembers, someone does. Applause rose, quiet but sincere. Ranger barked once, sharp, proud, certain. Above them the sky shone crystal clear. Sometimes God doesn't send angels with wings. He sends them with fur, 4 paws, and a bark that breaks through the silence of despair. Ranger was more than just a dog. He was a reminder that faith can walk beside us, that loyalty never dies, and that even in the darkest forests, God lights the way. This story isn't just about survival, it's about redemption, about second chances, and about the miracles we often overlook in the rush of daily life. How many times have we walked past someone or something that was sent to save us? How often have we ignored the quiet signs of God's grace? In your life, maybe you're feeling trapped, lost, or left behind. But just like Ranger found his way back to purpose, you too can rise from what tried to bury you. God sees you, He remembers you, and He is never late. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below, tell us what part moved you most. And if you believe that no soul should be left behind, that love never gives up, type Amen in the comments. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of love, courage, and the quiet ways God still works among us. May God bless you, and may He send a Ranger into your life when you need it most.
It started like any other Tuesday afternoon in the sleepy town of Waverly, Ohio, a stretch of rural quiet, dotted with old barns, sagging porches, and winding back roads that most people drove through without a second glance. Nothing much ever happened here. The local diner closed at 4, the post office shut by lunch, and if you heard sirens, it usually meant someone's cow had wandered onto the highway again. But on this particular afternoon, as the summer heat shimmered above the blacktop and kids chased sprinklers in their front yards, something strange broke the stillness. It was just after 2:15 p.m. when Officer Daniel Rhodes rolled down Main Street in his cruiser. His partner, a 4-year-old Belgian Malinois named Rocco, sat alert in the back seat. Rhodes was mid-sip from a lukewarm coffee when Rocco's ears pricked up. Then he started whining, not barking yet but making that sharp, anxious noise only handlers understand. Something was off. Rhodes glanced into the rearview mirror. Rocco was pacing, nose pressed against the window. "What's got into you, buddy?" Rhodes muttered, pulling the car to the curb. Ahead of them was an old-fashioned ice cream truck, idling in front of a small playground, the kind painted in pastel colors, with cartoon decals peeling at the corners. A soft jingle played on repeat, its melody oddly out of tune, like it had been warped over time. Kids were nearby, but none were approaching the truck. They were hanging back to watching. One mother had a hand on her child's shoulder, visibly tense. That was the first sign something wasn't right. Rocco barked, one sharp, warning bark that echoed through the cruiser like a gunshot. Rhodes had been on the force for 11 years. He knew Rocco's alerts. This wasn't curiosity. This was a trained response. Drugs, maybe weapons, something dangerous. He radioed it in as a welfare check. Nothing major yet. Hand stepped out into the thick summer air. The ice cream truck didn't move. No one leaned out of the window to wave. No cheerful call of who wants a treat. Just that eerie jingle, playing on loop, growing more sinister the longer it ran. As Rhodes approached, hand resting on his holster, Rocco began barking in earnest. Deep, rapid barks, controlled but intense. He wanted out. Bad. Rhodes could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Sir, Waverly Police," he called out, keeping his voice firm but calm. "You need you to step out of the vehicle." No answer. The driver's window was tinted dark to dark for a vehicle like that. The side window where kids would normally order was closed, latched tight from the inside. That's when Rhodes noticed the license plate, or rather, the lack of one. And that's when everything started to feel very wrong. He took a step closer, just as the engine sputtered and the jingle finally cut off mid-tune. A moment of silence, then the driver's side door creaked open. A man stepped out slowly. He looked ordinary, maybe late 50s, gray beard, baseball cap pulled low. He didn't look threatening, but his hands were shaking. "You all right there, sir?" Rhodes asked, trying to assess. The man didn't speak. He looked past Rhodes, right at the police cruiser, and locked eyes with Rocco. The barking had stopped. Rocco was frozen, now intensely focused, eyes locked on the man, his whole body tense like a coil. Rhodes reached for his radio. Something was off. The man suddenly turned, made a move back toward the truck, and that was all Rocco needed. The door of the cruiser burst open, and in a blur of fur and muscle, Rocco was out. Rhodes barely had time to react as his canine partner shot forward, intercepting the man before he could reach the back of the truck. The man didn't fight. He collapsed to the ground, covering his head, muttering something under his breath. Rhodes cuffed him quickly, calling for backup. The man kept repeating the same phrase over and over. I didn't want to. By now, other units were arriving. An ambulance pulled up, then detectives, then a crowd of neighbors who had been drawn by the sirens. Someone tried to open the back of the ice cream truck, but it was locked tight, padlocked. They had to use bolt cutters. What they found inside would never leave them. No one expected it, not in Waverly, not in a place like this. Inside the truck wasn't ice cream. There were no freezers, no popsicles, no sprinkles. There were cages. 4 of them, and only 3 were occupied. Small children, barely 5, maybe 6 years old, huddled in the corners, terrified, dehydrated and drugged. The 4th cage, it was open. Empty, and the whole town would soon realize. They were already too late for one of them. The sound of bolt cutters snapping the locks still echoed in Officer Rhodes's mind as he stood frozen outside the truck. The moment they pulled those rear doors open, the stench hit them: stale air, fear, and something else. Something unnatural. He would never forget the silence. That heavy, unnatural kind. Not a single child cried out when they were found. Just blank stares, sunken cheeks, and trembling limbs. Whatever had happened inside that truck, whatever they'd seen or heard, had stolen something from them. Something children should never lose. And then there was the 4th cage. Empty. That detail settled like a stone in Rhodes's gut. The 3 kids had numbers written on their wrists in faded marker: 2, 3, and 4, which meant there had been a 1, and now there wasn't. Detectives swarmed the scene. Forensics, Child Protective Services. Journalists would be here soon, and the nation would demand answers. But in this moment, all Rhodes could see were the hollow eyes of those kids and the slow, rhythmic thud of his own heart beating against his chest. He found himself crouching beside the smallest one, number 4, a girl with tangled red hair and a bruised lip. She flinched at his presence, instinctively curling away. Rocco approached quietly, sitting a few feet away, his ears forward but his posture soft. The girl looked at him, really looked, for the first time. And then she reached out, not for Rhodes, for Rocco. She placed her tiny, trembling hand on the side of his face, and the dog leaned in, pressing gently against her fingers. That's when the tears came, not loud, not messy, just slow, silent streams down her dirt-streaked cheeks. It was like Rocco had unlocked something she'd kept hidden deep inside. Rhodes turned away to hide his own tears. The man they'd arrested, so-called ice cream man, sat handcuffed in the back of a squad car. He hadn't asked for a lawyer, hadn't made a run for it, had barely even spoken since his arrest, other than his repeated, whispered phrase, I didn't want to. Detective Maria Sanchez had flown in from Columbus after hearing the preliminary report. She was blunt, efficient, and clearly shaken. Rhodes had worked with her before on a few trafficking cases, and he could tell this one was already hitting a deeper nerve. They questioned the man for hours. His name was Leonard Epps, a janitor, on paper. No previous criminal record. Lived alone, no family to speak of. He had been driving the truck for just under a year, but the truck wasn't registered to him. Nor was there any record of a legitimate business under the name painted on the side. Happy Licks Ice Cream. The trail of fake names and false addresses stretched across 3 states. When Sanchez came out of the interrogation room that evening, her face was pale. "He's not the one running this," she said quietly. "He's just ... part of it. And the worst part is, I think he really didn't want to." Apparently, Leonard had been coerced, blackmailed, threatened. He wasn't a good man, no one driving that truck could be, but he wasn't the mastermind. He claimed the children were picked up by others, dropped at predetermined spots, rotated between vehicles, hidden in plain sight, used and moved again. The truck was just one of many. But none of that mattered more than the child who was missing, the one who had been in the empty cage. Her name, they discovered, was Molly. She had been taken from a rest stop along I-77 2 weeks prior. Her parents had left the car running for just 3 minutes while grabbing food from a vending machine. She had been in the back seat, strapped in, watching cartoons on a tablet. 3 minutes gone. The case had barely made local news. An Amber Alert had gone out, then faded into the background like so many others. But now, they had a real lead. She had been alive, and in that truck, until recently. The question was, where was she now? As night fell on Waverly, a storm rolled in, the kind that announces itself with low rumbles and sharp wind, tearing through the stillness like a warning. Officers canvassed the area, searching abandoned lots, nearby woods, rest stops along the highways. Rocco worked tirelessly, sniffing for clues, following cold trails that ended in disappointment. Rhodes didn't sleep, neither did Sanchez, neither did the families who were now arriving from across state lines to collect their children, unsure if they should be grateful or devastated. One mother collapsed on the station floor when she saw her son, just dropped to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The boy didn't run to her. He just stood there, unsure, distant, like he had to remember how to feel safe again. Rhodes had seen a lot in his years on the force, but he wasn't prepared for that kind of heartbreak. The slow kind, the kind that seeps into the bones. He sat outside with Rocco at dawn, the rain having passed, the air heavy and wet. The town was quiet again, but it didn't feel peaceful anymore. He scratched behind Rocco's ears. "Where is she, boy?" he whispered. "Where's Molly?" Rocco simply stared into the distance. And then just after sunrise, dispatch called in with a report. An old truck matching the description of Happy Licks Ice Cream had been seen 1 week ago, parked overnight in a gravel lot just outside an abandoned farmhouse, 30 miles from where they'd made the arrest. The same farmhouse where, according to a local, they'd once heard a child's cry echo through the trees. Before the sound abruptly stopped, Rhodes stood up, so did Rocco. They were going to the farmhouse. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as Rhodes steered off the road, his headlights sweeping across the overgrown weeds that had swallowed the path to the farmhouse. The structure itself loomed ahead, gray and weather-beaten, with slanted shutters clinging to rusted hinges and vines creeping up the walls like fingers. It looked forgotten, just another piece of the past left to rot in the middle of nowhere. But Rhodes had learned not to trust appearances, especially now. Rocco sat in the passenger seat, unusually still. His ears twitched as the wind shifted. Something was here. Rhodes could feel it too, that low hum of tension in his spine. The way silence stretched just a little too long. Even the birds had gone quiet. He stepped out carefully, hand resting on his holster but not drawing. This wasn't about force. It was about listening, feeling, trusting instincts, sharpened over a lifetime of walking into places most people never dared. The boards on the front porch groaned under his boots. The door wasn't locked. It hung slightly ajar, as if someone had meant to come back but hadn't. He pushed it open slowly. The smell hit first. Damp wood, mildew, and something faintly metallic underneath. The interior was dark, lit only by streaks of morning light cutting through holes in the roof. Dust hung in the air, and every step stirred the past faint footprints. Scraps of torn fabric, the forgotten fragments of lives that had passed through. Rocco followed behind, nose low to the ground, body taut. His breathing shifted, nostrils flaring. Then he stopped at a cracked door that led down into the cellar. He bucked. Quiet, urgent. Rhodes's hand gripped the flashlight tight. He flicked it on and shone it down the stairs. The beam caught on concrete, then on wood, then on something else. A mattress, small, stained, pressed up against a wall. A doll's leg, peeking out from underneath. On the far end of the room, a row of bolts lined the top of a door, barely visible in the concrete wall, like someone had built a second room within the basement itself. It was too quiet, too deliberate. Rhodes radioed in their location, voice low and steady, then descended 1 step at a time, every board creaking beneath him. Rocco stayed close, head low, breath silent. At the base of the stairs, the air turned colder. He approached the bolted door, heart pounding. His fingers moved on instinct, undoing each latch one by one. When he pulled the door open, it groaned, like it hadn't moved in days. What he saw inside made him stop breathing. It was a room barely 6 feet across. The walls were covered in old soundproofing foam, the kind you might find in a cheap music studio. There were drawings on the wall, crude, shaky crayon lines of stick figures, trees, a sun, and in the corner, there she was, Marlee, curled into herself, wearing the same clothes she'd disappeared in, now threadbare and clinging to her like gauze. Her knees were pulled to her chest, her eyes red and wide, but empty like the light had been drained out long ago. Rhodes didn't move, not yet. He knew not to rush. Instead, he slowly knelt, keeping his flashlight low, letting her adjust to his presence. Rocco padded forward, quiet as breath. Marlee blinked at the dog. Recognition flickered in her eyes. Something stirred. A single whisper escaped her lips. Rocco, the dog, crawled forward and laid his head gently in her lap. That was the moment she broke. She didn't cry like the others. Not loudly. It came out in tiny hiccuped sobs, like the body trying to remember how to release pain. Rhodes felt a knot in his throat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a protein bar, unwrapped it slowly, and placed it beside her. She took it with trembling fingers. The rescue team arrived 10 minutes later, but it felt like hours. The medics moved gently. No questions, just blankets, warmth, and whispers that she was safe now, that it was over. But Rhodes knew better. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Marlee had been kept alive for what purpose, they still didn't fully know. But she had survived. Somehow, she'd held on. In that dark, cold room, she'd clung to life with a strength no one could teach. A strength he couldn't explain. Later that afternoon, while they sat with her at the hospital, a nurse gently took her hand and asked if there was anything she needed. Marlee looked up at Rhodes. "I want to go home," she said softly. Rhodes nodded. "You will." And he meant it. Even if it took every breath he had, she would go home. But back at the station, Detective Sanchez was reviewing more files, connecting names, tracing phone records, examining camera footage. What they had uncovered in Waverly was just one thread, in a much larger, far more disturbing tapestry. There were more trucks, more children, and someone somewhere was pulling the strings. The farmhouse had been a stop along the way, a temporary holding ground, but the operation itself, it was still out there, still running. And Rhodes, standing in that hospital hallway with Rocco beside him and the weight of the day settling over his shoulders, knew what had to come next. I had to go deeper. 3 days had passed since they found Marlee. 3 days, and Rhodes still hadn't slept more than a handful of hours. He stayed at the station most nights, reviewing reports, combing through call logs, retracing the route of the ice cream truck again and again on a war map cluttered with red pins. The farmhouse had been a critical breakthrough, but it also confirmed the worst fear. The operation was bigger than they thought. Rocco lay under the desk, occasionally glancing up at his partner, as if he could sense the weight pressing on Rhodes's shoulders. He had been more than a dog this past week. He'd been an anchor, the only constant in the chaos. Every time Rhodes found himself slipping into anger or despair, Rocco was there, grounding him. Marlee remained at Waverly Children's Hospital under a protective watch. She hadn't said much, but she didn't need to. Her presence, her quiet, breathing presence was enough to ignite something in everyone who met her. Doctors, nurses, officers, they all carried her story in their eyes now. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a mission. Sanchez had returned from Columbus that morning with a stack of files that looked like they'd been dredged from the bottom of a locked drawer. Hidden arrests, unprosecuted cases, mismatched fingerprints. She laid them out on the table like puzzle pieces. "I think I found our supplier," she said. The name she gave wasn't familiar to Rhodes. No big kingpin, no cartel leader, just a man named Ellis Granger, a logistics contractor, worked mostly under the table, kept to himself, rented warehouses outside of town and paid everything in cash. Connected how? Rhodes asked, skeptical. Sanchez pointed to a photograph. Granger standing beside a white panel van in front of a supply depot. In the background, barely visible, was the nose of the Happy Licks ice cream truck. Same dent in the bumper, same peeling cartoon sun on the side panel. "He's the middleman," she said. "Coordinates the transfers, handles the vehicles, picks up and drops off the ones too dangerous to trace." "Where is he now?" She looked at him grim. "We don't know." That afternoon they received a tip from an anonymous call routed through a scrambled line. The voice on the other end trembled. Said they'd seen something, a different truck. Not ice cream this time, an old plumbing service van. Parked for just 20 minutes behind a strip mall on the south side of Dayton. No driver in sight. But the caller swore they heard crying from inside. Then the van sped off. They traced the route, pulling traffic cam footage, and caught one blurry shot of the van turning onto a county road leading toward an old industrial district. That's where Rhodes and Sanchez went next. The area had once thrived with factories and train depots. Now it was a graveyard of steel and rust. Long-forgotten buildings gutted by time, with broken windows and collapsed roofs. The van had last been seen near a warehouse with no active lease, just a shell on paper owned by a shell company in another state. The warehouse was quiet. Too quiet. Even birds didn't nest here. Rocco was the first to signal. His ears perked, tail stiff, muscles locked into focus. He pulled ahead, nose dragging low against the concrete, weaving a line of urgency, straight to a side door partially hidden by a collapsed loading ramp. Rhodes and Sanchez moved in, weapons drawn but steady. They pried the door open. Inside, it was pitch black. Dust filtered through slants in the roof, illuminating only what the light dared to touch. The room was massive, rows of crates, boxes, discarded pallets, and silence. At first, then a sound, soft, subtle, a shuffle. Sanchez raised a hand, signaling stillness. Rocco growled, barely audible, but enough. They moved toward the sound slowly, methodically. Behind a stack of pallets, they found them. 2 children, huddled together under a tarp. 1 boy, 1 girl, pale, trembling, eyes swollen and red from crying. The girl couldn't have been older than 8. The boy maybe 6. They didn't speak. They didn't scream. They just held each other, like the only thing that mattered anymore was the warmth of another human body. Rhodes radioed in immediately. EMS backup. The whole unit mobilized within minutes, but it wasn't over. Not yet. As medics rushed to check the children, Sanchez wandered deeper into the warehouse, following Rocco, who hadn't stopped searching. Something still pulled at him. They reached a second room, this one sealed with a steel door. Sanchez used a crowbar to force it open. Inside they found the evidence no one had been ready for by dozens of them, labeled by state. Inside, pages upon pages of names, photos, birthdays, GPS coordinates, meticulously logged details of every child who had passed through the network. Some had check marks, others were crossed out, and many had no ending at all. They had stumbled upon the ledger, the record of a silent war being fought in the shadows. Rhodes stared at the rows of names, each one a life interrupted, each one a cry for help no one had heard until now. He didn't speak. Couldn't he? Just looked down at Rocco, who sat beside him unmoving, staring up with quiet understanding. They were in it now, no turning back. Because the story wasn't just about Marley anymore, it was about all of them. The warehouse was sealed by nightfall, locked behind crime scene tape and guarded by silence. The kind of silence that doesn't settle, but lingers. Rhodes stood in the parking lot, arms crossed, watching the last of the evidence trucks pull away. His shirt stuck to his back, not from heat but from the weight of it all. They had found 27 names in those binders that matched open Amber Alerts. 27 families who had never gotten closure. Most of those names would soon find a path home. Some, tragically, never would, but Marley was already home. Rhodes had gone to see her that morning. No uniform, just jeans and an old hoodie. He didn't know what he expected, maybe that same vacant stare, the deep silence she wore like armor. But she'd changed, not completely, not suddenly, but enough. She was sitting up in bed tracing a crayon across paper. The lines were shaky but purposeful when he walked in. She looked up. This time she smiled, a small one, almost a whisper of a smile. But real. And then she did something he wasn't ready for. She reached out, arms open, and hugged him. There were no words, just that moment. That simple, quiet act of trust, of thanks, of healing. Later she asked about Rocco. So Rhodes brought him in. She lit up when she saw him, the first real light in her eyes since they'd pulled her from that basement. Rocco walked straight to her bedside, laid his head on her legs, and stayed there as if he, too, needed to feel that she was safe. When Rhodes looked at them together, girl and doggy saw something he hadn't felt in days. Hope, not the loud kind, not the kind with banners or headlines, but the kind that endures quietly, steadily. The kind that survives. The arrests came swiftly after. With the warehouse evidence, the task force was able to move on several known players in the trafficking ring. Granger was found 2 states away, holed up in a motel under a different name. He didn't resist, didn't speak, just sat down on the curb and waited, as if he'd known this moment was coming. In the weeks that followed, Rhodes returned to patrol. He said no to press interviews, no to handshakes from officials who hadn't returned his calls to months ago. He wasn't in it for that. Never had been. Sometimes at night, he would sit with Rocco in the cruiser and drive past the old park where it all began. The bench where the ice cream truck had stopped. The place where a bark broke the silence. And every time he remembered how close they had come to missing it. 1 minute slower, 1 decision delayed, 1 bark ignored, and Marley might never have come home. It haunted him, but it also grounded him because it reminded him that doing the right thing didn't always look heroic. It didn't come with music or medals. Sometimes it was just a dog barking at the wrong truck. Sometimes it was showing up every day even when it hurt. Sometimes it was a little girl drawing a sun with crayons in a hospital bed trying to remember how light felt. They didn't save everyone. That truth would live in Rhodes forever. But they saved her. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to save others, too. As long as someone kept listening, as long as someone paid attention, and as long as one bark was never ignored,